Oh, hello, Liz. Hope you feel better now again.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Susan West. I'm your host today. I welcome you to the first webinar of the Post-Foundational Approaches to Comparative and International Education Special Interest Group of the Comparative and International Education Society. The webinar is titled Discussing Comics and Notions of the Human. After a brief introduction, our guests will first share with you their thoughts on the comic series Division, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Each panelist will have roughly 5 minutes. It follows a conversation among the panelists before we open for questions and comments from the audience. Now allow me to introduce our panelists. Elizabeth de Freitas is a professor in the Education and Social Research Institute at Manchester Metropolitan University. Her research focuses on philosophical investigations of mathematics, science, and technology, pursuing the implications and the applications of this work in the learning sciences. Her book, Mathematics and the Body, Material Entanglement in the Classroom, published with Cambridge University Press in 2014, won the Outstanding Book Award of the Area Curriculum Studies Division. Daniel Friedrich is an associate professor of curriculum and chair of the Department of Curriculum and Teaching at Teacher College, Columbia University. He is one of the co-founders of the Post-Foundational Approaches to Comparative and International Education Special Interest Group. His book, Resonances of El Chavo del Ocho in Latin American Childhood, Schooling and Society, has recently been published by Bloomsbury Academics in the series New Directions in Comparative and International Education. Jinting Wu is an assistant professor of educational culture, policy, and society at the State University of New York at Buffalo. Her research interests include anthropology of education, transnational curriculum inquiry, and schooling and social change in contemporary China. She's the author of Fabricating an Educational Miracle, Compulsory Schooling Meets Ethnic Role Development in Southwest China, and the co-author of The Global Convergence of Vocational and Special Education, Mass Schooling and Modern Educability. Her work has won multiple awards, including in 2013, the CIES Gail P. Kelly Outstanding Dissertation Award. And now, without further ado, allow me to hand over to Elizabeth de Freitas, who will share her thoughts first.
Oh, me first?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm not sure if it makes sense for me to go first, but I can. I mean, I was sort of hoping. Daniel, did you want to go first, or?
I can if you want to. It's fine.
Yeah, I just thought maybe because you're having initiated the conversation, it made more sense. But.
All right.
Okay.
So just one reminder for everyone to, if you can, mute your microphones while you're not talking, so that there's no echo. So briefly, the idea of this, thank you all for attending, and especially for Liz and Jinting for giving up your time. This is a graphic novel that I'm a comic fan. I read a lot. You can see my little Green Lantern there. So I know I have a different attachment to this thing than most. But I thought, as I read it, I have always resisted intellectualizing this work because of personal reasons. But I thought this was good, sort of prime to having an interesting conversation. Not necessarily because everything is perfect about the graphic novel, but because it provokes certain questions. So I'm going to just mention a few. I'm going to try not to go too long. But first, so it's interesting that Vision, I'm going to assume that everyone has read it, right? So the Vision attempts to join the human experience by creating a family for himself and moving to his suburban home in Arlington, Virginia. But one thing that's interesting for me about this is although they, in some ways, would try to join the human experience, they don't try to hide their insanity. So their faces are bright red and metallic. They have no pupils in their eyes. They openly use their powers. Their mailbox is the only one that is floating in their block, hovering using tiny rockets. So it's not like they're trying to pass as humans, they're just trying to have that experience. So in that sense, I think that the vision centers attention on a very specific pedagogic act. That is a failed attempt at learning to be human by being stuck in the middle of a human, non-human existence. Which prompts a question that I think for me is very interesting, which is, what specifically is being learned by those who endeavor to learn to be human? But are they learning to be human, or are they learning to be white? So the suburb they live in, the school the kids attend, the kinds of interactions they tend to read as typically human, and the role they expect to hold in the community ooze whiteness. For me, there's a surplus of whiteness over the whole comic that is really sort of not talked about, but in some ways is quite explicit. So let me see if I can share if this works. This specific scene that you might recognize when Vin takes one of the bullies by the throat, so the principal is calling the parents to the office, right, to tell them that their son, who is a gun, metal shaped to kill, should not attend school anymore, right? And so what the vision says is, I am the vision of the Avengers. I have saved this planet 37 times. Each day you live, each breath you take, each beat of your heart, each due to my actions, 37 times over. You're quite correct. It's not a decision to make, but it's my considerate opinion that this is the proper course of action to keep the kid in school. So is there anything more white than this sense of entitlement? You should listen to me because it's who I am. But however, there's a countercurrent to the entitlement that undermines the vision's whiteness. Early in the series, it becomes quite clear that no matter what they do, regardless of whether they follow all the rules or whether they manage to keep their powers in check, or whether they can learn to take on all the bullying without responding to it in ways that would certainly end it, they will never be considered fully humans. I think there's a scene that has a couple of repetitions. This series uses repetitions in a very interesting way, and of course it's not unique in it. But there's a flashback in when Vision is lying in bed with his ex-wife, the human or mutant Scarlet Witch, in which she tells this joke, right? The two toasters that one turns to the other and says, do you sometimes feel empty? And then the other toaster says, oh my God, a talking toaster. In this first time it's shown, Scarlet Witch laughs at the joke and Vision laughs back. But then the scene is repeated again at the end of the same chapter, in which Vision tells the same joke to Virginia, to no reaction. So the visions are constantly out of sync with their surroundings, and the things they are told that make humans human, like in this case, humor, or reason, or sex, or customs. Here I want to make a parallel without, of course, pretending this is the same, but just a parallel to think about between the ways in which whiteness and the attempts to be and the constant sort of being out of sync feels, with the way in which Black parents continue to talk to their kids in real life about the things they witness on the media and in their lives of police brutality against their community, attempting in many cases to reinforce the pragmatic need to follow certain behaviors that might minimize life-threatening risk, but also knowing no behavior can guarantee their inclusion in the category of life worth protecting, or life equal to mine by dominant majority. So I think there's an interesting period of racialization that goes on in this comic that can be used to further conversations, curricular conversations about race, humanity, inhumanity, and those who are deemed other. Finally, one last thread is Virginia, who for me is maybe the most interesting character in this comic. She's seen throughout the series dealing with the existential anguish, usually associated in popular culture with the lonely stay-at-home suburban motherhood. She stares out the window, sits motionless in the couch after vacuuming, and calls her husband to chat, as he's too busy fighting monsters in outer space. Virginia never seems happy to learn what it means to be human, and it may be this unhappiness what makes her the closest any of the characters is to actually becoming human. Yet she fails. Their struggle, the vision struggle, the way in which many humans around them react to their struggles, and our own reading of this struggle pushes us to question the ways in which our efforts to gain recognition by those outside the norm are always already set up to fail. And I want to finish my comments with this sentence that's uttered, I think, in the first chapter, by Vision explaining to Virginia the difference between this is kind and this is nice, and which Virginia says doesn't make any sense. And Vision says, to assert as truth that which has no meaning is the core mission of humanity. All right, I'm going to end there.
Thank you, Daniel. I would now list or Jinping, who wants to go next?
Don't mind.
You don't mind? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, was that, okay, sorry. Okay, so that was good. I think that was really helpful that you went first because I didn't get a chance to scan any of the pieces that I was going to reference, but I wanted to take or situate my response to the piece in relation to some of the theory around posthumanism. So hopefully this is of interest in this conversation. And so I put some stuff on some slides, so I guess I could pull that up. They're mostly just notes from my own thinking, but I'll just show them because they do have a few names attached as well. So I think I need to share my screen. Is that correct? Oops, hold on, I've just lost you guys. Let's see. Okay, so how do I share the screen again? You pull your little arrow over your image, over the video image, and in the upper right corner, there's
You should be able to just share the screen with the center icon. If you're in the quick start on top, if you're in the quick start tab, the center icon says share screen. If you're the presenter, you'll be able to share screen, which you are.
Sorry, I don't see a share.
Yeah, it's the top left, where file, edit, share.
Oh, okay. Right. So under share, I see. Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So where is it? Can you guys see a slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. I guess I could show that to the slideshow. All right, so what I'm interested in is how these comics produce visions of the non-human or the inhuman, or if you want to use the term more than human. And what I decided to focus on, since we don't have that much time really, is the image of computation and life that is entailed in the story and in some of the graphics. And although I think it would be great today if we could talk a little bit more about the graphics, I don't think my analysis has yet sort of reached that stage, because I did want to couch my comments in terms of my own lack of familiarity with the Marvel comics. And although I am someone who's really interested in fiction and have written fiction, and I'm interested in speculative fiction, I don't have a lot of experience with this genre of text. So keeping that in mind, bear with me as I share some of my ideas around this. So I will just say that my interest in participating in this conversation with all of you was to do with my interest in the speculative turn in philosophy and the role of fiction and science fiction in thinking very differently about philosophy of education. So what I wanted to open with this quote from Bryant and Harmon from a great book from way back in 2011 is because of the way they critique the centering of humanity in various philosophical projects and the attempt to sort of think beyond human images of thought or human images of even the human. And so I thought that was kind of my starting place really in terms of my critique of the comics and in terms of why I found them stimulating as well. So again, my interest in speculative fiction is very broad, but again, I don't have a lot of familiarity with the Marvel comics. So in fact, this was a really hard read for me because I just didn't know the references. Like even this morning, I was, on Wikipedia looking up the life stories of various characters, and I mean, this is an incredibly complex, layered network of narratives, and that's, I think, becoming more clear to me as a really fascinating space for curriculum discussion. And going back historically, but also through these incredible layers and folds of story. So what I wanted to talk about was the images, various images that get produced throughout the two books. And so the first image of matter or of bodies that gets deployed or mobilized. And we've already, we've already seen some of those images and understand that these are, human shapes of various kinds. They're called synthesoids, right? And they're made out of, we learn in the first pages that they are made out of, they're androids made out of human blood and organs. And then we learn a little later that they also have some brain waves that probably have been recuperated from somewhere else. And then but they are sort of a cyborgian kind of creature. So there was a very, very strong focus, emphasis, and assumption around what a body is and what matter is versus non-matter. And so one of the things I found myself thinking over and over again in a somewhat frustrated way was this sort of focus and obsession with the organism, with the biological and the organic. And that is that the image of the body that was deployed through, very canonical classical images of the attractive female figure and of the attractive male, white and heteronormative, and some of the connections to what Daniel was talking about in terms of, let's say, norms of society that are perpetrated and propagated without always being interrogated. So in my focus, instead of whiteness, I wanted to look first at bodies. So I wanted to mention the work of Maxine Sheets-Johnson in my second bullet point there, because she's very good theorist around undoing and debunking the idea that the body would be the container of cognition and of thinking and of will and of despair and of affect and what have you. And so what I wanted us to talk a little bit about today was about different images of bodies that come perhaps out of a very different notion of life. So something that comes up a lot in my work is discussions of contagions and viral life and swarm intelligence and all the different ways in which moving away from the organic or organism image of the body can help us think very differently about what it means to be in a collective of some kind. And I think that this is really important in terms of the images that get used in these comics around when we see the schools, and what we see when we see the schools are these strangely populated spaces of bodies that are anonymous and reflected through these glass surfaces. And that sort of begins to go in that direction, perhaps. But when we're at the home and the space of the family, it's this very, it's this very much the affiliation, the father, and the father with his son, the father with his daughter, the mother, the family unit. So I was reacting very strongly against this very this hardcore emphasis on family, and I found it kind of disturbing, to be honest, at the end of the second comic, to read the final pages of the authors and the artists. And I guess this is where they acknowledge support from others and assistance from others. And there was this strange sort of thank you to the wives and families of the artists that I thought, wow, so this really is, a reflection of the author's genuine celebration of a very nuclear image of what the family is, maybe. So what I wanted to put forward was like this idea of filiation, of having sons, of reproducing other humans, versus other ways of life continuing and flourishing or dying. So other other ways of thinking about the continuation of life rather than this family image. So foliations and folding and foliation is really big in my own work, so I'm really interested in that. And invagination, crenulation, all the other kind of queer ways in which life might propagate and survive, let's say, dangerous monsters as they come to destroy the earth. And so one of the theorists I draw from, and I really like, is Xiaojin Wei, who's a engineer slash philosopher who used to be in Montreal, and now he's in the US, and he talks a lot about thinking about computation as a worldly process and being part of a mathematical ontology, and that it's, you know, the project is to think about ecology and environment rather than the organism. So that was one of my interests, was what's the image of the body that's coming up in this work? What is, the second one was what's the image of technology that's being assumed? And so Simondon has this, the notion of the technical object, and I was really thinking long and hard about, you know, to what extent are these synthesoids, these visions, technical objects? And of course they are a kind of cyborg, this is how they are presented to us. But there's some sense in which they are very different, that they are cyborgs, whereas all the humans in the stories are not cyborgs. And Andy Clark has, you know, and many others like Simondon have argued that, you know, you really need to see yourself as a cyborg, that it's an always already kind of experience, that technology shouldn't always be seen as that thing which is other than human, so that in fact, you know, part of the image of the human must see that as folded into that way of life. And so this is something I was thinking about, was what's the image of technology that gets circulated through the story, and to what extent is the image of a cyborg really an adequate one in terms of it being, does it end up positioning all those humans in schools and in the neighborhoods and in the outside of Washington as they end up, you know, complying to the norms of society? Does it end up creating a false image of those humans because it doesn't adequately recognize that we are all natural-born cyborgs, in fact, not just the superheroes. And so I was thinking also about how the animals in the stories were presented. So there was a dog, a couple of dogs, I guess. There was a cyborg dog, but of course there was a brain rescued from a killed dog earlier on. So I was kind of interested in that and how that, you know, to what extent the non-human as the animal was being entered into the stories. And so that made me think about some of Catherine Hale's great work on how we become post-human. And I guess I should have mentioned Donna Haraway on this slide as well. And I found myself thinking a lot about these comics because, again, as I said earlier, I'm not that familiar with the Marvel comics, but the kind of anxiety about the technology that is really well developed in the story in terms of, like, you know, the way the neighbors George and Nora make these kind of snide comments about, you know, you're robots and toasters and so on. And so I was thinking about the anxiety around our being cyborgian as a big part of the big interesting part of the story. And to get back to the body, the energetics versus informatics. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in these two comics about informatics, about, you know, processing and computational power, and because these, of course, are the particular skills, let's say, of the visions. But then they have this energetics as well, because they have these, they live in the material, mechanical, Newtonian world of having been, you know, constructed out of matter and also of human organs. So there's this sort of interesting mix of energetics and informatics that's becoming more and more interesting, I think, in terms of us understanding what is the role of technology in our lives. So 2 more slides. So image of life. So this is where I really started to think more critically about the book. And while I was reading these two, I was also reading a book that's edited by Claire Colbert that just came out on critical life studies. It's actually called Posthumous Life, Theorizing Beyond the Posthuman. It's an edited collection, and it just had a lot of really good articles. So simultaneously, while I was looking at the comics, I was reading this other book. And I was thinking about, you know, what is the image of life that's getting developed in these comics? And one of the things I wanted to talk about was the right to die, you know, the capacity to die, because it sort of fascinated me. And even today, this morning, when I was doing some more research, that you know, the Grim Reaper gets to just keep on coming back, right? Like they keep on getting reincarnated in various ways. And one of the most shocking pieces in the comic was page 4 or something when the Grim Reaper shows up and kills the daughter. And I'm thinking, whoa, wow, that's interesting. I guess I hadn't really grasped the fragility and the precariousness of these Vision's lives, because you know, this guy was this terrible monster, the Grim Reaper, arrives with his scythe, his superpower scythe, and he's able to actually kill her. I mean, she has to be resuscitated in very extravagant ways a little later on in the story. But it became more and more interesting to me in terms of thinking about this genre to begin with, or more generally, to discuss with kids in schools about images of life and how the right to die or the capacity to die is folded into that image of life, or is it not? So, you know, so what does it mean to die, I guess, for this kind of life? And I guess that's linking to my earlier comments too, right, about the phenomenological paradigm of the organism and how to think very differently about that. So what does it mean for, aside for a rhizome to die? How does a swarm die? You know, just kinds of two different, you know, multiple ways of thinking about not just life, but death. So Deleuze came up, and he always comes up in my thinking about this kind of work, and he talks very carefully about two kinds of automaton too. So I was thinking about that in terms of, you know, these are robots that have a kind of spiritual side to them. They, however, do not seem to pursue, as Deleuze would hope that they would, an inhuman will to art, which is sort of the mark of the spiritual automaton. So this is sort of in the spirit of, let's say, surrealist automatic writing would be a perfect example of a spiritual automaton, where you connect with something that is bigger than you through being an automaton. And through being that kind of automaton, you actually connect. Whereas a psychological automaton, which is presumably what these monsters and these cyborgs are critiquing, are the kinds of people in Washington who are not thinking and who are behaving very normally and who are being too white without knowing it. So I think I can end there. Is that what Suzanne wants me to do?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
I think I want you to wrap it up if possible.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, so that, I can talk a little bit more during our discussion about
Yes.
the image of technology and computation and calculation that's being mobilized in the stories, and why I think it's a very, very narrow conception of calculation or computation. These are robots that have computing as one of their superpowers, so I'd like to talk more about that. But the last thing I just want to touch on is the image of conflict. So what is the nature of this war that is always happening in this environment? Why is it that the Vision has to go off and fight this kind of strange war with monsters who are trying to destroy the Earth? Why is he always saving the world? What does it mean to save the world? In this genre, does that always mean to rescue humanity? Because in fact, I think maybe in the post-human literature, we're quite interested right now in saving the world that is not just about rescuing humanity, but has another image of the future. So I'll just end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. I'm passing to Jinting.
Okay, I think I just unmuted myself.
Your presenter now.
Okay. So I'm glad I went last because I find Danny's point and Elizabeth's perspective really, really interesting, and some of which converge with my own reading of these two very interesting volumes. So in the full sense of disclosure, I'm really not a comic person. The last comic book I read was probably in the childhood a couple of decades ago. So this exercise gave me really a rare opportunity to dive into a genre that I normally do not associate myself with. And I have to say, I found the reading immensely interesting, at times disturbing, and definitely thought-provoking. So there are many different ways of interpretation, and I'm going to structure my comments along a couple of points. But first of all, my overarching observation is that despite the human's outward differences from the human, I actually find that their endeavors reflect many of the darker side, or rather the baser form of humanity. And if I may argue, I think their very efforts to live like ordinary humans and the encounters and happenings that occur therein are in fact a very human-like process. And as far as how I define human, I'll come back to it at the end of my comments, but I'd like to explain what I mean by their efforts being very human-like. First of all, do we ever wonder why the visions return to the planet Earth? And why do they try their best to fit in and live a normal, peaceful life in the DC suburbs? Right? Isn't it the case that they already sort of achieved this supernatural power and they're not at all confined by things like time and space? They can penetrate matters, they can travel through time, returning to the past and seeing and even reprogramming the future with ease. So why do they return? To me, their return really represents a profound kind of a disenchantment with their own status of existence, if I may put it that way. They want a new kind of normal by looking across species to become other than themselves. So in these 2 volumes, we see many times the vision says, and here I quote, "I am the vision of the Avenger. I have saved this planet 37 times. Each day you live, each breath you take, each beat of your heart, each is due to my action 37 times over." So when I was reading this, I kept thinking, doesn't that also describe things like air and oxygen that we breathe in? Right? Each day we live, each breath we take, each beat of our heart is due to their action, not 37 times, but billions and billions of times, right? And yet, what distinguishes vision and the natural environment, like air and oxygen, is that there is an unrelenting kind of a need for recognition and preeminence, right? The air doesn't say, I want to be recognized, I want to be appreciated, and so on and so forth. So that need for recognition and for preeminence is kind of a trait that defines humanities from the rest of the planet. And interestingly, in the book itself, at some point, Sister V said after a game, she said to Brother Vin, understanding and embracing preeminence actually moves us closer to humanity. So I was thinking, aren't many of us like that, right? Wanting to be one other than ourselves and desiring preeminence. And I think there is a profound existential dilemma that seems to be shared by both humans and non-humans. I'll move on to my second point. I think just like the humans, the vision kind of remains stuck in duality. Right? Reading through these 2 volumes, you see a lot of dualities, us versus them, hatred versus love, happiness versus misery, conquer versus defeat, challenge versus revenge. The visions are really not able to see the world any differently other than in the same dualistic way. So the consequences of this kind of thinking, aided by their supernatural power, is a chain of misunderstanding leading to bloodshed, violence, destruction, and so on and so forth. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Vin got into a fight with a schoolmate, Chris, which is otherwise a perfectly ordinary event among teenagers. So after that, the headmaster brought the Vision parents to the school. He sort of interrogated Vision and his wife by saying that, do you know what I'm going to do with the kids who brings a gun to school? These 2, Viv and Vin, as you say, they are guns. And then Virginia retorted, my children are not guns. And the headmaster said, what do you want me to say about that, Mrs. Vision? You want me to argue with you? Want me to show you what your kids can do to my students? So in a sense, the headmaster's interrogation is not entirely unfounded, right? Given the gravity of the incident, the students could have died. And that interrogation triggers Vision's very defensive mechanism. They end the conversation with the last word. And here I quote, the Vision says, I believe you will understand fighting with me in this matter will not in the end prove to be beneficial. So here I really see a classic moment of kind of an impasse in the human-non-human relationship, or shall we say human-human relationship, that we see so often in our contemporary kind of a multicultural, multi-everything world. In the sense that everyone wants to claim their own identity, everyone wants to kind of exaggerate their own difference and uniqueness without seeing the underlying sameness. Just like the humans, the vision shows a similar set of self-centeredness, cunning, complexity, and not infrequently vengefulness and violence, right? Examples are many. Virginia killed the Grim Reaper when he became a threat to the daughter's life, and later on took the life of the neighbor's son, Chris, and reduced the father to a permanent state of unconsciousness. Not only that, the family killed the neighbor's dog, a clueless and really innocent creature, and used the dog's brainwave to make their own family pet. Later on, the vision also took their own cousin Victor's life to revenge for Vin's accidental death. So the story goes on and on and on. So what happens in their own kind of an unrelenting desire to be ordinary? I think they also exhibit very extraordinary sense of volatility. You know, you want to be accepted at the same time, but they're completely incapable of acceptance. You desire to fit in, but everywhere you also make a statement about your own differences. So in the end, when everything else fails, there is a sense of vulnerability, of recognition of their own limits, which I think is exaggerated by a moment after the son's death. So the vision ponders, perhaps as unlikely as it seems, there is indeed a God above us, someone to greet our soul when we leave this life, someone to tell us that we have done enough, that we have done what we could, that now finally we could rest. So to me, this is again another quintessential moment when the superhuman and the human come together, and that is to say, they share a profound sense of vulnerability and the search for the infinite. And even though for many the answer remains perhaps, and the answer can never be found. So to sum it up, what can we learn from it, and what implications does it have for education? I want to come back to my earlier comment about how do we begin to think differently about human and humanity, and I think this point was touched upon by Danny and Elizabeth as well. So if we look at science literature and religious literature, I think science and religion agree on one thing. That is, human being is the highest form of evolution so far. But we often forgot the two words, so far, and think that human beings are the peak of evolution. So I think this is a very big and arrogant mistake in the statement that we unfortunately are propagating through our public media, through our education, and popular readings like the very existence of comics. So as far as the evolution beyond the human life is concerned, science has very little to say. At best, they can say through the lenses of science fiction, such as the very comics we're reading today. But as we all have seen, the answer they provide is far from satisfactory. So now what does ancient mysticism has to say? What does Eastern sort of philosophy and spirituality has to say? That perhaps there is an enormous level of evolution beyond the human beings. So in a sense, we're like frogs in a well, going round and round, and we can imagine this is our own universe. So in the sense of the Foucauldian lenses, we are preconditioned to see the world in a particular way, in a particular framework, and we are unlikely to go beyond what was given to us by our schooling, by our society, by our upbringing, and so on and so forth. So if we dare to imagine there is a vast ocean of evolutionary levels awaiting humanity, right? Just as there is an equally vast level of lower form of evolution, or I shouldn't say that lower form, different forms of evolution as we see today. So how can education play a role in nurturing this different kind of human, or rather a different version of human, that are not bounded by the instinctual dilemmas that we see that are manifested by the life of the visions? a different kind of human that are willing participants of their own growth and evolution. And that's the overarching question I would like to end with this discussion, and perhaps we can come back to it during Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the other two panelists for sharing their thoughts. It was a bit more than roughly 5 minutes, but I think it's interesting, and it gets the conversation going. And I suggest that the panelists now actually unmute themselves so that you can be heard. And I invite you to come into conversation among the three of you. And I should also remind the audience that you can start to send questions through the Q&A that we will later bring up into the conversation.
So can I go with it? Thank you both. This is very, very thoughtful. The third death is really interesting to me because Liz brought up the question of what does this rise on the die? What is the role of death in the stories of the non-human or the imagined non-humans by humans? Brings the idea of the continuous role of death in this series. But I would argue there is no death in this series. I mean, that's one of the things that is sort of interesting, right? And this thing, in a way, also to the genre of comics. Comics is not, so comics, at least in this kind of like Marvel universe, universe where they have been publishing for 70 years, right? And the characters are always the same age. Every time they die, they come back. So there is actually no death. And no death means also, in some way, no learning, right? Because if the characters would actually learn from, if they actually would remember the 70 years of their adventures, they would go insane. And how can they compress all of that in actually their like fictional lives or lifespans, right? So in a way, it's a universe in which death it's in some ways meaningless. And I think it's interesting to pursue to like, is there any learning when there's no aging, when there's no when Virginia dies and the last page you see Vision rebuilding her. So has he learned anything? If there's a sense of stasis, right? But I don't say necessarily critically, because maybe there's a potential to think about curricularly what's the need for a space where there's no death and no learning. What other possibilities are open when death loses its finality, where we're not racing towards the end of life. So we have to learn everything. The lifelong learner has to learn everything before that life ends, right? So if that race sort of, if we could, at least in some, I like this idea of a speculative term, but if we could speculate with a non-ending life and death as not present, then what kind of other paradigms are open up when learning is not the one where it's leading us to this end of life?
Yeah, I found myself thinking about the way in which is there an echo on? You guys okay with a bit of echo here? I was thinking about them as recursively iterating themselves. So because there's sort of a there's a sort of fractal life that they live, because they recursively, they get resuscitated by some means. We see a couple of examples where they plug into their solar power, right, to recharge in such a planetary way that they can resuscitate the daughter and so on. And I think Vision himself says at the very beginning, oh, there's something wrong with my wife, but wait, I just created her out of someone else, and wait, and I was part of that as well, and is there something wrong with me, and I've been reproduced again. And so the nature of filiation, like the production of the son, of a human from a human, is altered and given a different image through that kind of iterative recursion. They come back and they're like, okay, take this. The Grim Reaper dies and comes back about 7 times as well, and he himself is the Grim Reaper. So yeah, you're right. Like I totally get that death is totally complicated in this world. So I was trying to imagine exactly what you're asking now, which is like, what is this other? What are other ways in which mutational repetition is being explored through these comics? Maybe this links to Jinting's comments about evolution, actually.
I was actually thinking along the same line, but not to use the word death, but to use a different form, which means more or less the same thing, which is existence. I think if you think about the recursivity of life coming over and over again as a form of learning, or as a form of sort of learning so that we can graduate to the next level of evolution. And if that learning is inadequate in this particular cycle, in this particular span of life you are given, perhaps to come back again. Just like the story, the multiple version of Virginia being both the Scarlet Witch and Virginia, and who knows what her next incarnation would be at the end of Volume 2, right? Volume 3 and Volume 4. So I think that it's not only a metaphor to say that in all of us there is a will to be reformed in somehow, to be redeemed, to be something other than who we are. But from a macro perspective, I think that recursivity is something that needs to be ultimately do away with. I don't know. I feel if existence is permanent, there is no beginning or end to it. You certainly want to think about other form of existence rather than, back either as a cyborg over and over again, doing the same thing over and over again.
Saving the world 37 times.
Right, saving the world 37 times, maybe 74 times now. Yeah, what's beyond that? I don't know. And another notion related to this is free will. I think back to when the vision was created by the Ultron, right? In one of the conversations, he was saying that when the first word uttered to him by his father, Ultron, was that now I've given you life, and yet you are only a half-life, right? You are here. I created you just so you could obey. And you see what happened later on. The Vision and the rest of his family acquire something called the free will. Even though they are pre-programmed somehow, he can go into the brainwave with the wife and check what happens and make sure that what happens next will follow a particular pattern. So it's the coexistence of both free will and some kind of a destiny they're trying to break out of, which I think is fascinating. And it really mirrors what we are doing here as part of the humanity. Right? We also exhibiting free will as much as we can, right? Especially in the Western liberal democratic world, we want freedom as much as we can. And yet at the same time, we are also kind of doomed by that particular version of freedom given to us, right? Which is their form of justice. I don't know, I'm venturing too far, but...
They talk about, just to add to that, yeah, I think I remember the Vision talks about how we have purpose, that the visions have purpose, and that, that's sort of a telos, right? They have actually, even though they're trapped in a meaningless recursive existence, or repetition of the same in some sense, they also have some weird purpose, which is to save the world. And I think that to the extent that that connects with their sense of free will or not, I'm not sure, but I think that's a problem or a problematic associated with the superhero model, right? Which is, and this idea of the purpose is to save the world, because I think it has to be interrogated. Because if you think your purpose is to save the world, then I just think we need to have a conversation about why you think that's your purpose.
Sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, and you interrupt. Just carry on. For Vision to be able to fulfill his purpose, his kids have to go to school, which they don't need to. His wife has to stay at home, which she doesn't need to, right? but there has to be this nuclear family for vision to be able to be an Avenger and fight the monsters, right? So I think there's also there a notion of purpose that is very specific to comics, to the audience of comics, and but it's also, it has such a universalist claim to what the purpose is.
Yeah, and I think it comes up in the comic when the humans don't have that same purpose, right? Like somehow they say, this has to do with the absurdity of human life, right? So they point to, like you guys had mentioned already, the kind of meaninglessness of human behavior and human actions and human decisions, because the quote-unquote mission of the human is meaningless because it's not rational enough. It doesn't embody the logical deductive image of computation, right? That the vision does. And so I think this links up with the apparent the image of the technical object as being machinic and not human, and that's a very particular image of technology that's being mobilized in the story.
And the other question I kept thinking was, what are the implications for students and children who are exposed more and more to this kind of genre? I mean, the stories are interesting in and of themselves, but I don't know, this comic certainly lends itself to a Hollywood production. I probably envision in the not too distant future somebody in Hollywood will pick it up and make another movie out of it. So what are the larger curricular implications for not only students in the classroom, but just for the broader audience who sees this as part of the quintessential American life, right? First of all, you have the individualized superheroism that is being prized. In a sense, there's a sense of pride, right? I saved the world 37 times, and now you just got to learn to do the same thing, to have a purpose, which is to go above all and everybody else, right? The sense of competition that the society takes so much pride in, I don't know, right? Just see the world in this particular black and white fashion. What does that have to say about our generation several decades from now on? I think the technological part of it will be much more available than today. Perhaps you don't need a computer. I think cell phone will be something like a dinosaur. Half a decade from now, half a century from now, you probably only need to look in the air and the number will be dialed and you can connect through some kind of intuitive devices. So technology aside, what are these other ways of being, of existence? And that, I think, is a purpose too. In one of the conversations in the volumes, I think the vision said, yes, we have purpose, but you just are. You just want to be, something like that. I can't exactly remember where it is. I think part of perhaps saving the world is part of their purpose, but the other part of it is trying to just be. And that be itself is being existent and it's being modified by our technological computational innovation, and yet in that innovation, something is deeply disturbed and shifted.
So there are some questions that I would like to read, if this is okay with you, from the Q&A that I'm seeing. So, and I'm not sure if they're sort of leading into different directions, but for example, Sun Young Lee asks, she says she's interested in the term vision itself described in the comic book. Vision is not only ocular, sense like observation, but also has the temporal like mission as vision. So how do panelists think about the ocular or temporal sense of vision? I would add especially that ocular can also be something technical. So that would be one question. I'll go on and read another one before I turn to you. Noah asks, he really appreciates the discussion of Virginia as suburban housewife. What do the panelists make of her killing of the Grim Reaper, but then claiming he fled? Does this help us think about human and non-human death?
Yeah, I can start with the second question if that's okay, because I found that, and just maybe just to open that discussion back up or bring that back to Virginia, because I think she is a really fascinating character, and that that's when she lies. I found it in terms of plot, I found it very confusing. I didn't connect with the plot, the motive. I didn't quite understand why Virginia, as that character, decided to lie, because it really didn't make sense to me. I thought, especially the more I learned about the Grim Reaper, it seemed like why wouldn't she have spoken to her family about it? So I think I would love to know what the others think about that, first of all. But then the question raises this issue of lying. And I think lying comes up in some really interesting places in the story, because, of course, this means that the Vision has to lie to the police officer. And there's a couple of boxes in the story where it says, oh, this is a really significant thing, the fact that he's lied to the police officer, because, I mean, I guess, is this a particularly human capacity, the capacity to lie, that somehow, you know, in the image of Warren McCullough's image of, you know, of the neural net and of the computational paradigm of thinking and cognition, you know, lying is not really folded into that in any way. So I think this question about lying is really interesting. I don't know, you know, what, I think maybe, you know, Daniel knows the genre better, so maybe lying comes up in other comics. But for Virginia to lie about the killing of the Reaper was very enigmatic for me. Yeah, I really didn't know whether the authors had decided that was the best way to kind of create tension in the family or not. But I did think, you know, obviously it's her role, she becomes this sort of completely enigmatic potential disruption of the entire family. She's the sexualized creature, right, who comes out in the really sexy pajamas, and you know, she's the creature that then can kind of destroy the family unit through lying, sex, and boredom, right, which is the housewife's dilemma, and who's stuck in the suburbs somewhere. So, you know, best character for sure for completely exploding all of these concerns around the normalcy, right, of their lives. But that's all I'll say.
I think the line has to do with superheroes don't kill, right? So that's sort of the one of the tenets of at least mainstream superheroes that are not trying to play the anti-hero. They're that traditional superheroes don't kill. Of course, they all do at the end, and that's what big conflict emerges. And when Superman kills is a big issue. But in general, superheroes don't kill. And so I think Virginia is trying not to disappoint her husband's view of what they should be supposed to be doing, right? Her husband wants them to have a quote-unquote normal life, which is disrupted on page 2, like when the kids ask Ben, are you normal? With the little sheet of paper, are you normal, right? But he wants them to have a normal life, and killing a bad guy is not a normal life. That would bring attention to everyone. That would reinforce everyone's fears about them. That would legitimize everyone's concern that these toasters are gonna make everyone's life more dangerous. So I think I see Virginia's lying as part of that protection of that attempt at normalcy. And what I find interesting about what you were saying also is that so Vision is not supposed to be able to lie. Like the program is not supposed to allow him to lie. But Vision was created as sort of a mole, right? So he was created with this bad guy, Ultron, with a bigger robot to infiltrate the Avengers and destroy them, but then he rebels against his programming. So in the first story he appears, he rebels against his programming. So why is he yet still not able to rebel against his programming in life? It's part of this idea of there is no learning, right? So if people would, if the characters within the comics would actually learn, would actually their own stories from 40 years or that these characters have been alive, or in some characters 70 years, they would know that vision can reveal into programs and lie. But there is no learning. There's no possibility of learning from other stories. Otherwise, just briefly, there's one comic book author called Grant Morrison who played for a while with the idea that Batman remembers every story that ever happened to him, and that drives him crazy. So his whole story is about Batman being completely crazy because he remembers 70 years of ridiculous stories. So in a way that can't be part of the mainstream comics, because then the properties, which are like very valuable capital for the companies, don't be struck.
Before this, maybe Anselmo was adding to a comment on this one. He's saying, isn't the father the originator of the family? But his children and his wife seem to know life better than he does in their empiricist perspective. So isn't this a sort of criticism of patriarchal education, a tradition from an empiricist perspective? And also I would like to add one in terms of, because they've been talking about learning and evolution, which I find very interesting too. To what extent is evolution should be thought or as learning as well?
Can I just comment on the patriarchal aspect? I think, yes, certainly there are places that can be read as patriarchal, right? If not, why should Virginia hide the fact that she killed the Grim Reaper from her husband? And yet, at the end of Volume 2, you also see the opposite of patriarchal logic here, which is Virginia set up this very calculated plot so that her husband goes to the headquarters of the Avengers and try to kill his cousin, and yet it was ultimately Virginia herself who killed Victor, right? So I think in that very cunning design of the plot, I think she turns the patriarchal, or for lack of a better term, up on his head. And again, in these instances, we see the use of free will, right? Even though the vision were designed in a particular way by their own maker, and yet ultimately at that very last moment, vision was brought face to face with his maker, confronting, I don't remember the exact details, but I think he was confronting Ultron or other form at the very last scene. So again, free will comes up in the sense that it shows a great deal of, if we talk about it in a contemporary way, it shows a great deal of our agency, right? In shaping and designing our own destiny. But in what way? In what way? Going back to the question of why is Virginia lying and hiding the fact from the family? In the act of killing the Grim Reaper, I think there is a moment. This is a moment of transmorality to me, because she was trying to save her daughter from, to her, a lesser form of life or existence, right? So it's just like you go to the hospital, you take an injection, right? You have some disease and you need treatment, and in that process you take antibiotics. So as simple as that. You save your own life, but you're killing millions of germs and viruses in your body. But we don't think about it in the sense of, oh, we're being immoral. We're killing millions of lives to save my own. But I think in that sense of transmorality, that she firmly believes that she was doing something absolutely right, and yet she feels uncertain about her act. She feels that a sense of right and wrong creeps into her consciousness. That's why she tries to hide. So I agree that Virginia is a very fascinating character, and in her you see the embodiment of this blurred idea of right and wrong, even though I said before there's a dualistic thinking, but I think the dualism was also not as clean-cut in some instances.
Can I just, Suzanne had mentioned also one first question from you on the idea of vision as ocular and the concept of vision. And I really find the cover of the second volume, for those of you the physical thing, which is here lies a vision. May God have mercy on his soul with the vision of the dark hand, right? And I think of, on the one hand, we could say that, okay, vision was sort of named by Ultron as his vision of world domination. But at the same time, I think I find it really, really interesting how the authors, they play with this notion of a vision of a normal life, a vision of humanity, a vision of a morality, but also how the family, basically everyone has a name. So you have Virginia, Ben, and Viv. Except for Vision, so the visions are the family, but also Vision is the male patriarch of society, who is also the creator of the family, right? So I think there is something about how it's playing with the notion of how vision and has a vision about what all these things mean, and he creates the vision in those members of the family.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that too, because I think you're onto something there in terms of vision. Like, it's not, I had in my slides talked about an image of technology and an image of human life or life. And when with a vision, like you said, it's sort of the visionary has the vision. So vision is a much more loaded term than image, right? So image is very kind of, an image of thought is sort of what we've been talking a lot about. But a vision of life has an ideology folded into it for me. So a vision is a much more loaded version of an image of life. And so I think the ideology that's folded into the character's, attempts to live in a particular way is captured nicely in this use of the term vision. And then, of course, the kind of blindness of their white eyes, right, as they wander around, gives the contradiction of flesh and an image to look at, too.
So I can bring up one more question. Jacob was also sort of referring back to the idea of talking on evolution. He commented that evolution has always had a problem to progress due to human interference, thinking we are at the peak already, which gets us back a little bit to some of Jinping's thoughts.
That's a question.
Not a question, it's a comment.
A comment.
Mm-hmm.
In some way, I think this transitory state of human life can be thought as sort of an interim stage. Before that, you have, much simpler form of life, the amoeba, animals that live in the water, and so on. And I think this interim stage, we are making a lot of big statements about this being the ultimate form, the peak of civilization or evolution, and we are oftentimes very blinded, even by our science, right? Talking about the ocular sense of what defines what we can see. Nowadays, it's the science, right? We have to prove, the scientific community often asks us to prove, whereas in the past, if you think about in the time of Galileo and what was the other person, they claimed that the Earth is not flat, right? Copernicus, exactly. And yet, they have to prove to the religious community that this is the case, right? And in today's world, the order is completely the opposite. We have to prove to the scientific community that seeing is believing. This ocular-centric, ocular-driven way of seeing is really framing the way we understand our existence in very particular, or shall we say, narrow way. As far as what will go beyond the human form of existence, science has very little to say. As much as they are trying to sort of expand the frontier of scientific, so-called scientific discovery, if we are confined by this particular way of seeing, there is very little that can be said. So interestingly, how education can play a disruptive role in that process, that's a larger process that can be said.
I think evolution and can be contrasted with involution in an interesting way. So if there's no learning and no, if the kind of recursiveness that we see in this world of the comic is not an evolution, in the sense that evolution is typically an adaptive process in which learning is environmentally situated, then something is very odd in this other world, of the comic world, and maybe there's a kind of involution that's occurring as these characters and narratives are being folded into this labyrinth of stories. That would be my only response to the concept of evolution.
If no one wants to add to this, I have another comment from our audience. So you says, how is the notion to be interpreted in the context of Vision's statement that to assert as truth that which has no meaning is the core mission of humanity, related to the notion of dying. And also synthesoids are supposed to have purpose where humans supposedly do not. So I think this connects a little bit to saying also about there was a time you used to have to prove to science had to prove itself to religion, and now it's sort of the other way around. Religion has to prove itself to science.
For me, that notion of to assert as truth that which has no meaning is the core mission of humanity. To assert something that has no meaning is not the same as to lie. For me, those are two different things, right? So I think what the Vision is saying, and it relates to what Liz, I think, was pointing to, which is the very narrow portrayal of computing that the comic book portrays, right? In this very narrow understanding of computing, the world is binary. Things are either true or false. Things are either have or don't have meaning, and therefore they are pointing to sort of the limits of their own computerized brain to assert that which is the core mission of humanity, which is it's a surplus to what they can do, right? Because for them, in this very limited notion of computing, synthesoids or computerized brains can only assert that which has a meaning, right? It has a very positive understanding here of the production of language, of words, of actions that are correlated with something in it. So I think lying is different. Lying has to do with an intentionality of portraying something that is not what it is. But because Virginia is shown to lie and Vision is shown to lie, I think they don't see that as necessarily saying something that has no meaning. It has meaning within their own pursuit of their purpose and their own pursuit of normalcy. So I think it has to do with that. When they assert that as the core mission of humanity, what they also are saying is within our computerized brains, we cannot do that. We can never be humans because we cannot do that. That's different from what we can try to learn. That's why Vision tries to tell Virginia what's the difference between they are nice and they are kind. For Virginia, it makes no sense. She still tries to learn that. It's an attempt, but it's an already failed attempt. So that's my comment on that question.
Yeah, that's such a. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick comment on Danny's comment. I think lying was very nicely illustrated when Viv, the daughter, found out the mother was lying to her about her classmate Chris's death, right? The moment she found out, she went into this big tantrum. She destroyed the family dining table just as the same way the mother destroyed it before. So the act of lying is not only an act to remain some kind of let me phrase in a different way. The tension around lying is not only part of their efforts to be normal, to remain normalcy, but also a way to sort of form some kind of a family order that is being disrupted, because otherwise, for me, the encounter between Viv and Chris was a very telling moment of, and I think it comes very close to our human relation, right? Teenagers develop fondness towards each other, and they were heartbroken when, you know, things happen and so on and so forth. And yet, in the Vision's order of things, in the larger order of things, in the Vision family, Chris' death doesn't count for anything. It's only a very minute detail that they can simply erase and put aside. Disregard the daughter, one of the very intimate members of the family, despite her very kind of despite the significance the event meant for a daughter. In the larger scheme of things, it was completely erased. So I don't know, I just wanted to point that out as one example of how this act of lying can be seen from multiple edges and lenses.
When I looked at it again this morning, I looked at the beginning and realized that Nora and George, it says at the beginning, Nora and George, I can remember reading this, the very first pages, you know, Nora and George will end up burning to death in their house, you know, at the end of the story, and these will be their last thoughts or something. But when you were speaking, Jintik, I was thinking about the kind of accidental deaths of Nora and George and Chris and what have you, that are quite different than the very heroic deaths of conflict, the heroic images of conflict that we see with the Grim Reaper or later on with and against the Avengers. And this is a bit of a divergent from the question about lying and the way it operates, but you're bringing back, I guess, the question of death and whose death counts or is significant. And I guess, to some extent, when I heard, you know, to assert as true that which has no meaning, it was sort of like to assert as true that which is insignificant. It was almost like they were using meaning in that way, in terms of a measure of significance. What matters in the long run? Do you always become a villain if you stick around long enough, you know, kind of thing? And, you know, so what matters in the long run, or what's meaningful in the long run? And so I was thinking about those accidental deaths, like you just pointed out, the ones that are just kind of put under the rug.
So do you, who sort of posed the question, has I think a comment that's worth mentioning at this point to what extent, like why do they want to be normalized? For example, fit into suburban America and send the kids to school. It seems they feel the need to learn to have a meaningless existence, which I think it fits interestingly, right? What's the purpose or what's the meaning? So maybe the lying and sort of the emptying out, this is maybe the purpose, right? To create meaninglessness in order to sort of appear as human. I think it's an interesting comment from the audience.
I think they, like I said in my initial comments, I think they both want to fit and they don't want to fit. I mean, they have the technology certainly to create holograms and look human. They could try not to use their powers in public like many other superheroes do to have a secret identity. It's not a secret identity, right? So they're not Superman posing as Clark Kent trying to have the human experience and hiding so that people treat him as a human. So they both move to the suburb and they go to school, but they are not they're trying to have their own vision of a human experience without losing themselves in it, without pretending to be humans, without pretending to not be visions, not be symbolists. So I think it's a little different than just camouflaging or trying to fit in.
There's some interesting comments at the beginning around this too, where they say, you know, when they set the scene and they say, okay, they moved to this suburb of Washington, where everybody used to, and they describe this sort of community of people who at one point had a purpose, at one point had a political agenda to change the world, you know. So they got out of college and they wanted to be lawyers and activists, and you know, they were going to, you know, change the world by way of Washington, but they were too close to Washington, so they fell in love, had children, got a family, and then began to comply and become meaningless. And that somehow maybe, you know, the scene is set that, you know, you have these kinds of desires to save the world when you come out in your 20s and you're sort of empowered to do so through your education, let's say. But there's this incredible compromise that occurs, and then, you know, so in some sense, this family simply represents all of those other families that are in their midst, right? That they are just the very superhero desires that everybody had in their early 20s end up being like basically choosing the neighborhood with the good schools, which is exactly why they're in Cherry Hill, even though they have to send them flying for some reason. They've chosen, you know, this neighborhood is a neighborhood with good schools.
So I can read one more question from Renee. But then we have about 4 minutes left, and we should be wrapping up. So first, asked, to the discussion of existence, being, and purpose, I would suggest that the vision quest to be human seems to be require an exoticizing of what it means to be human. Like later on, he says, students are making other of oneself. Do you want to share a comment on that one?
I don't know if this corresponds particularly to that comment, but the idea of self, of making a statement about the self, is quintessential to the Western way of organizing society and social life. For someone, I am coming from a non-Western, or even that is not a correct way of saying it, outside the West, for lack of a better term to phrase it. I think the desire to be other than the self can be interpreted in two different ways. One is to say, in the way that the comics has depicted, that they try to fit in. They try to live a sanctioned form of normal life that assumably has some benefit attached to it by fitting in and living in the suburb of a predominant white community, so on and so forth. So being other than yourself, so to speak, blending in, has a pragmatic end to it, right? You have a normalcy. But a second interpretation of this very same phrase, being other than ourselves, again, I'm going to go back to that evolutionary notion, is to try to change the self rather than try to make a statement of how different and how unique we all are, which I found very, very problematic in much of our education and social discourse in this particular context. So being other than ourselves in the second sense is to try to break out of that, the cocoon, the boundary that through generations we have made for ourselves or by the society. Ultimately, what is that difference? I keep coming back to the question, to the metaphor of you know, you have this balloon, you know, think about this balloon as being all these unique and different individuals. They all try to make a statement of being a superhero, being the world saver. But ultimately, the air inside the balloon and the air inside another balloon and the air outside of it is probably the same thing, right? So I think our educational discourse emphasizes less on sameness and more on differences. Of course, there's a hugely kind of an emancipatory rationale behind it, because we want to make all these different communities feel welcome. But I think by sort of demarcating the world in too many different ways, we miss the larger point of the sameness, and which is another meaning of how to be other than ourselves, how to break out of this self-made cocoon and always try to fight. You know, even in Vision's little family, right? These family members supposedly programmed in the same way. They are fighting too, in some way. And there's very little effort being made to try to be other than the current version of humanity or the current version of yourself, so to speak. I'm not making sense, perhaps.
I do think this might be a good place to stop the conversation, if you agree. I think what I will do is there has been some more questions from the Q&A. I will compile them and share them. And also, if people in the audience or you panelists feel like you have more thoughts come up that you want to share, that you need to, I suggest that you send me an email, and I will collect these and put them together and share them with the PfA community. And so if you allow me, I would come to an end of this first webinar today of the post-foundational approaches to comparative and international education special interest group. I thank our panelists for their thoughts and remarks and conversation. Also, I thank the audience for participating. We will be posting the link to the recording of the webinar on our website. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you guys.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Danny, I'm trying to make you host again.
Yeah. To right click on my name.
So that went well.
Yeah, thank you, Victor.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Victor.
You're welcome. All right, I'm signing off.
Bye.
Bye. So before you go out, I'm wondering, Danny, whether we can, I want to keep the Q&A. I'm wondering whether you or I can export it.
It's